The title is Say My Name, right? University students' experiences of the pronunciation of their names. Jane is Associate Professor of Sociology at Nottingham Trent University in the UK, where she leads the Gender Research Group. She is a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and as a self-described sociological names nerd, Jane studies people's names to analyze, understand, and deconstruct identities and inequalities.
Hello, I'm Jane Pilcher from Nottingham Trent University in England, and I'm here today to talk about my project looking at the students' experiences of the pronunciation of their names in universities in England. Hannah Deakin was the project researcher. I'm a professor of sociology who studies people's names to examine issues of identities and inequalities. To give you a flavour of my work, in 2016, I published a journal article where I argued that although the sociology of identity and the sociology of the body had taken account of each other, both had overlooked the importance of names. But of course, bodies and identities are inextricably interlinked with names. In other bits of my work, I've looked at names and gender identities and gender inequalities. And of course, ethnicities are another really important set of what I call embodied named identities. Names convey ethnic identities. They can convey racialized identities. On the one hand, ethnic names can be purposefully and proudly chosen by parents for their baby to declare and signal their baby's ethnic heritage. It's a really positive thing. But on the other hand, ethnic names can mean that the person so named can experience racial discrimination. An example of this can be found evidenced in the work of Zweisen and colleagues, who show how a person's chances of employment are worse in terms of job applications if you have a name that's perceived to be a non-white name. So in my talk today on the pronunciation of students' names, my focus on this topic comes out of my broader interest in these kinds of issues around names, identities, and inequalities. Why is it important to look at pronunciation of names in universities? For one thing, names already are seen to matter for equality, diversity, and inclusivity in universities in England. So, for example, most universities have anonymous marking practices to try and prevent conscious or unconscious bias in the marking of students' work. And likewise, there are campaigns to cite women and Black academics in our writing and our publications, or to cite more of them, I guess. It's also timely to look at the issue now in the UK, the issue of names in universities in the UK, because of the socio-cultural profile of students that is changing and has changed over recent decades. So as you can see from the data on the screen, there are more international students studying in UK universities, particularly at postgraduate level, and there are more students of Black, Asian, and other minoritized ethnicities studying in universities in the UK. Now, these kind of data suggest that UK universities have become less mononational, less monolingual, and less monocultural than in the past. And that alongside these changes, we might expect there to be a wider cultural diversity in the names that students have. As I've mentioned, there's already a kind of equalities, diversity and inclusivity focus in policy terms in UK universities. And I'm interested in the part that names can play in the equalities, diversity, inclusivity agenda. I'm interested in the part that names can play per se, but today I'm talking about the part that the pronunciation of students' names can play in that agenda. So what do the few studies on names and naming in education show? There's a bit of research that's been done about the voluntary use of English names by some international students studying in English-speaking universities. For example, Chinese students. And this has been argued to be a pragmatic response to students' worries about the writing of their name, the spelling of their name, the pronunciation of their name by educators in the host countries. There are also some studies on students' involuntary naming experiences, and this is essentially where their names are mispronounced by their educators, or where their educators decide that then the student's name is too difficult to pronounce, so that they're going to call them by some other name. These kinds of practices have been argued to be an expression of cultural and racialized inequalities of power and privilege, and to be racial microaggressions. There's also been a study by Zhang and Noels, which has looked at university students particularly, and this found that half of the university students they researched said that the issue of the pronunciation of their name was of some importance or of high importance, and half of the students they worked with found it to be an issue of low importance. So about half and half. It's not an important issue for all students whose name might be subject to mispronunciation. So taken together, these studies suggest that the pronunciation of students' names has got an important relationship to issues of equality, diversity, and inclusivity, and does potentially have impacts on students' feelings of belonging and their engagement in university communities. But evidence around all this from the UK is lacking, and hence I wanted to do my own study to look at the circumstances in the UK. So my study is the first academic study of pronunciation of students' names in the UK as a kind of equalities, diversity, inclusivity issue. It's the first study per se. It's a small scale study. It's an exploratory study, and it ran over a sort of period of 6 months or so, from the tail end of 21 to April 22. It had 3 parts to it, my study. The first part was a survey of English universities' policy and practice around the pronunciation of students' names. The second part was where we worked with undergraduate students, third-year undergraduate students, and we used creative writing methods with them to try and capture their name stories, their experiences of names during their university studies, and then we held follow-up interviews with those students. The third part of the study was interviews with university staff, staff who were in teaching roles or staff who were in professional services roles, librarians, study support advisors, for example, whose role brought them into contact with students. Here are a selection of the student experiences. I'm only going to talk about student experiences in this talk today. So that's the focus of this talk. So what are student experiences of the pronunciation of their names during their university studies. So here are some voices from the students themselves, students who shared their experiences with us either through their name stories or in their follow-up interviews. So examples you can see here range from experiences of outright racism, in the case of Venika, to renaming, to name avoidance, to feelings of being uncomfortable, of feeling that they don't belong, feelings of being disrespected and dishonoured. But also, right down in the corner there on the right, bottom right-hand side, some positive experiences too. So here we have Amir, who told us about the time when a lecturer kept saying my name again and again till he got it right. And that was a really good situation of someone trying to get my name right. So there are positive experiences around name pronunciation at universities. But as we shall hear, there are also some less positive experiences. So we were interested in how students deal with incidents of the mispronunciation of their names. What do they do when their names are mispronounced by university teachers or other members of the university staff who have a kind of teaching role? We identified several strategies that students might use when this happens. These included a strategy of correction. So this is when a student actively intervenes and tells the teacher that they are saying the name wrongly. Also strategies of accommodation. And this is where name mispronunciation or renaming is kind of unchallenged or accepted by the student. And you can see examples of these here on screen using the voices of the students themselves. What's also clear from what the students told us is that context matters in terms of how students respond to incidents of name mispronunciation. So things like class size. Does it happen in a big class? Does it happen in a small class? Does it happen in a one-to-one meeting? Depending on that kind of context, students will use different strategies to deal with the mispronunciation of their name. Is it an online class or is it an in-person class? Again, this matters in terms of the strategies that university students might use in relation to the mispronunciation of their name. Also, things like, what's the likelihood of there being a future interaction with this person? So if it's a one-off encounter, perhaps with a librarian or a learning support advisor, then a student might think, do you know what, I'm not going to bother correcting that person because I'm not likely to meet them again. I'm not likely to encounter them again. But if it's going to be a durable relationship, a long-term relationship over an academic year or even throughout the period of study at a university, then students are much more likely to kind of take action and do something about it, using a strategy of correction, for example. Another important factor impacting upon how students respond to incidents of name mispronunciation is their perception of the power relations between themselves and university staff. Of course, it takes courage and confidence to correct someone's mispronunciation of your name. And students told us that it was often difficult for them to take that step to correct someone's pronunciation. So this might be to do with feeling respect for the job-based, role-based status of the teacher. They are, after all, a teacher. It might be linked to respect for the teacher being older than they are and therefore respecting your elders and feeling reluctant to correct them on that basis. Students also told us that they were worried about the consequences of correcting a teacher and telling a teacher that, you're pronouncing my name wrongly. So in the two central speech bubbles on the screen there from Rika and from Bako, they explain how they don't dare to say stuff because they're scared. They're scared that, these are the people who are checking assignments and exams, and they don't want to kind of be penalized about having corrected them in the past. So as Bako says, they'll mark my work with my name, and so I try to be friendly and not seem cross about my name when they mispronounce it. Some students reflected that during their university studies, they did become more confident over time in correcting staff members. So on the previous screen, there was a quotation from Vinika, who spoke about, when she was a first-year student in the first year of her undergraduate studies, she didn't correct staff members. But gradually, as she progressed through the years of her studies, she gained in confidence and was more assertive about how she wanted her name to be pronounced and to try and ensure that it was pronounced correctly. We found that international students, because of their particular cultural backgrounds, their cultural values in their home countries, were often more concerned about correcting teachers. So this might be to do with the very high status role of teacher back in their home culture, or it might be to do with the very high status accorded to people who are older than you in their home culture. So these were factors which meant that international students in particular were reluctant to correct mispronunciations by the teaching staff who were educating them. So there's a lot going on in terms of students' experiences of the pronunciation of their names by university staff. And it's clear that it involves a lot of work and a lot of emotions on the part of students. Students told us about this hard work, the ongoing, repetitive nature of having to correct name pronunciation time and time again throughout their time at university with multiple different people in numerous different contexts. As Amir says here, I don't want to keep having that conversation. It's clearly tiresome, tedious, unpleasant extra work that these students have to do. And the hard work of this might help explain why students voluntarily rename themselves, or why students might accommodate involuntary renaming by other people. It's just easier. It's less exhausting to do so after a while of having to do that continual hard work. So these findings from my Say My Name project, looking at pronunciation of students' names in English universities, show that personal names are key to students' experiences of their identities during their time at university. If you want to find out more about the study than I've been able to share with you today, you can use that QR code showing on screen. From an identities as social processes perspective, so drawing on the work, for example, of Irving Goffman, we can see that identities are produced in and through social relationships, and they're produced in particular contexts where often there will be power and inequalities circulating. So what should and could be changed to disrupt the imbalance of power, to disrupt the inequalities that shape the experiences of the students, for example, in our study, whose names are subject to mispronunciation? We think there should be a shift from, to borrow from Goffman's work, the front stage to the backstage. So from the perspective of students, their experiences of name mispronunciation mostly took place in the front stage. in the front stage context of university environments. So this is either in classrooms with other students being present, or even in one-to-one meetings with staff. So these are front stage settings where it was the students who had to do the hard and tedious work to manage the mispronunciation of their names. We think this identity work should be shifted from the front stage and away from individual students to the backstage, so that the management of name pronunciation shifts from being the student's responsibility to the university's responsibility. This can be achieved by implementing what I call whole university strategies that deal with it from the point of registering a student to the point of the student graduating from the university. And the key to these whole university, whole institution strategies are technological solutions that already exist, but are currently used by very few universities in England. My own university does not use yet, I'm working on it, any technological solutions of this sort. So the kind of technological solutions I'm suggesting are embedding students' recordings of how their name should be pronounced in students' record systems. We already have students' record systems where there are photos of our students, but currently we do not have student record systems which capture the pronunciation of their names. The other side of that is audio name badges included in everyone's email signatures. So this would normalise declarations of preferred pronunciations of names, and it would help, along with the students' record systems name recordings, having those embedded, it would help improve people's skills in saying unfamiliar names. Thank you so much for listening. Here are the references that I've used throughout my talk. And right at the bottom there on the right-hand side of the screen, I've included another QR code for those of you who might be interested in the People's Names Research Network that I lead. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. A really interesting presentation, so sensitive. And in fact, you have reminded me of our own problem for this conference, because, you know, we were concerned about mispronunciation of the speakers' names, which is something that, you know, may be embarrassing and suggests maybe lack of concern or... So thank you. Are there any questions? So I have one. I was wondering whether you have kind of noticed any special relationship between some areas, I mean, in terms of how widespread this phenomenon is, whether maybe it may affect more universities with large numbers of students or different areas of the country.
I think it does make a difference in terms of which sort of universities we're talking about. So, for example, one of the major music universities in London, they have a large number of students studying from overseas. So they actually were, this is something I found out from the survey that I undertook, they actually were amongst the best of some of the universities, because they've long had lots of international students studying. And, you know, relatively speaking, they're a small university compared to some universities in the UK. So they were able to implement a number of different solutions and felt that they were addressing the issue quite consistently and well. I think sometimes universities that are so large that they don't have systems in place, these kinds of issues kind of fall in between different groups. So if there might be so for example, at my own university, we have an international students kind of service, And they are quite good at addressing issues around the pronunciation of students' names. For example, that my own university's had me in several times to run workshops, for example, based on my research, and encouraging people to think about ways in which they can address the pronunciation of students' names. So in big universities, you can get small groups of people who are very passionate about it and recognize the importance of it, but getting the ear of the senior leadership team in those universities to try and implement, as I've said, kind of whole university or whole institution solutions can be quite difficult to achieve.
So we have comments and questions. One is from Sarah, who says name badges for the conference would be a very good idea. Then we have Alexa. A enlightening road experience for me was having my name mispronounced as I was handed my BA diploma. 4 years of blood, sweat and tears, and it was such a cruel moment for me in what was supposed, to be my proudest moment. It's one of the things that brought me here. Thank you so much for this talk. Then we have Eva. Calling out names as students walk their graduation stage was an issue at our university. Now they no longer have the deans do this, but someone who speaks that language. Also send recordings and also hand a paper to the announcer before walking across the stage. Is this an issue in the UK?
Yes, absolutely it is. Again, in the survey, we had several people responding on behalf of their institutions, including people whose job it is each year to read out, students' names, and they're saying they dread doing it, they dread getting it wrong, and they work really hard, and they have their own sort of ways of trying to ensure they pronounce their students' names correctly. And that could mean asking a colleague who speaks that language. It could mean, going on Google and randomly Googling how to say a name. But they felt that was all very unsatisfactory, and it was a lot of work for them, and it caused them a lot of anxiety and stress.
So we are running out of time. Sarah says, my name was mispronounced at my PhD graduation. My name is the Welsh spelling. And Alexa, my college where I they keep running, sorry, that's why, where I got my AA at a linguistic anthropology professor called the names. You could see people beaming with joy as she nailed every single one. And Sarah, again, the constant mispronunciation of my name was the reason for me coming into onomastics. Clive, I think there should be some consideration of whether or not the names include sounds which are not found in English. I think one reason Chinese students in particular prefer to choose English names is that it is almost impossible for someone who has not grown up with a tonal language to get the tones right in a tonal language like Chinese without years of practice. And then about 5 years ago, I stopped calling roll on the first day of class and started having students introduce themselves, preferred name and pronounce instead. I love the idea of audio name badge as well. Do you have any ideas for how I can use this in my classroom?
You could make it a little task in the classroom for everybody to create their own audio name badge, and then you could go around and have them play it.
Sarah, that's a very nice comment, indeed. English is the only language I've come across where my name is pronounced incorrectly. Sounds great, By the way, my surname, I guess, is pronounced incorrectly in English because you tend to say Z, and so Caiazzo, that's how they pronounce it. Instead, it's Caiazzo.